Hey, Sharice. Hey, everyone, and welcome to part one of Surviving Trauma. I hope that you all find this information helpful. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're going to give a couple more people a chance to join in. But while we're doing this, I just want to welcome you all so much and thank you for taking time out of your evening to join me today. I hope that this session, as well as the follow-up session, which will be held next Tuesday, is informative. One of the things that I do want to mention is that I want to stay connected with everyone here. So if you feel comfortable, please feel free to leave your email address in the comments. If you want to direct message me, please feel free to do so. I want to make sure that everyone is connected, and I want to make sure that I'm able to stay connected with you all. One of the things that I want to mention also before we start the talk today is that in doing trauma work, I want to say that there's no way that we can touch on the depth and the breadth of trauma. When I'm doing trauma courses, they usually last a minimum of 3 to 4, 6 hours to 6 months. But what I'm going to do in the next hour is try to talk about or highlight key important things that'll kind of help us understand. Hi, Kathy. Yes, I'm taking attendance. Try to help us understand how people can end up in certain situations. With all of the talk surrounding the Surviving R. Kelly docuseries, a lot of the talk that we hear on social media is concerning even confusion about how people end up in certain situations. And so we are going to take it back. We're going to start from the very basic of trauma, how it impacts our brain development, how it impacts our relationships, and how people, and then looking at it across the lifespan. So when we think about that, I want to just say too, when we think about trauma, one of the things that I want us to recognize is that true trauma-informed care or true trauma-informed work takes the belief that every person that we meet is the survivor of something that they would consider to be traumatic. Every person that we meet, every person that we come into contact with. Many of you, or many of us have seen or heard that saying, you know, be kind to everyone. Everyone is fighting a battle that you don't know about, which what that really means in trauma-informed care language means that every person that we meet is a survivor of something that they would consider to be traumatic. Now, when we think about trauma, I want us to just think about a visual. Trauma can really be defined as I have a stressor here, and my ability to cope with it is down here, meaning that we all could have the same experience happen to us, but we would all have very different physical, psychological, emotional, mental responses to this trauma. And trauma, the impact of it is so major that it has lifelong implications. So I have my handy dandy whiteboard. I'm going to be using this today to draw us some visuals. Also talk about ways that we can understand trauma broken down. So I want to draw two things. What you're going to see me draw is a basic timeline. And then I'm going to draw another timeline, and I want to highlight it. So for those of you who have children, I need to think about taking your child to the doctor. And so one of the things that we know is that when we have children, this is called our physical and cognitive development timeline, this timeline right here, right? That straight line. So this is from birth until wherever we are right now. And so this measures, you know, at what age were you able to talk in two-word sentences or follow two-step directions. Now, at the same time, there's another timeline that's developing that's called our social emotional timeline, right? And that's this timeline here. And the only difference is that it has gaps. I don't know if you all, let me make it bigger. So say there's a gap here, and a gap here. So let's say on my social emotional developmental timeline, I wrote the number 4. So I'm in the store and I'm separated from my parent, right? And so what feelings do you think that brings up for a 4-year-old? Maybe I'm confused, I am scared, I feel abandoned. Now I want you to ask yourself the question, what feelings do you think that brings up for a parent? Probably the same feelings. Now, what happens, I don't know if any of you have ever witnessed parent-child reunification. I used to work in the mall, and so children used to be drawn to clothing racks. Like, it's like I don't know, Harry Potter in there. And so, you know, they would go in these clothing racks and the parent is not paying attention and the parent would turn around and all of a sudden their child is gone. So that brings up the same feelings for that parent, right? Panic, fear, confusion. I don't even know where to start. Now, parent-child reunification in public places is a whole traumatic experience in itself, right? There's no violin playing, there's no rose petals falling from the sky. They're not running to each other in slow motion. Usually that parent's fear has turned into anger, right? And so for that child, what I feared the most was being separated from you. But that reunification is even scarier than sometimes the separation. And so in my social emotional development, there's a gap here. And then let's say at the age of 12, I witnessed community violence, right? So that brings up another set of emotions. And then at the age of 19, I experienced heartbreak from my first major relationship. So now I'm 30, I'm 40, I'm 50, I'm 60. And I know that I can't be separated from my parent the same way that I could when I was 4 years old. But I'm in a situation that brings up the same feelings: fear, loneliness, confusion, abandonment, the need to be loved, the need to be comforted. And so what we see is a regression back to the age of 4, right? So when we talk about trauma, the reason why I do this timeline, when we talk about trauma, I'm not talking about how old you are, right? Because a lot of times with trauma, what we're hearing in surviving R. Kelly thing is people should have known better, or you know, they're old enough to know better, or they're old enough to just leave. But when we talk about trauma, we're talking about these gaps. Why do we have these gaps? The reason that we have these gaps literally is because it's my brain's way of trying to regress and close these gaps so I can continue to develop. Now, the interesting thing is that I can't close these gaps if I don't have new skills. So that's why I want you all to think about relationships. How many of us know someone, or we have been in relationships where the pattern is the same, the partner is just different, right? I keep regressing back to this point. I keep regressing back to this point in my life. And it's because literally my brain is trying to close this gap so that I can move forward. But again, if I haven't learned skills, I'm not going to see that happening. So I want us to keep this in mind as we go forward with the training, or as we go forward with our talk today, because again, when we think about trauma, we want to always understand that trauma impacts our social emotional development. We're going to get into that from the brain perspective. And the reason for that too, when we think about the brain, so the purpose of the brain is very simple. The purpose of the brain is just to keep us alive. And I want to focus on 2 areas of the brain. So that means that when we talk about trauma, one of the things that we're also hearing is that, you know, especially in the Surviving R. Kelly docuseries, or even looking at Centoya Brown, which is another case that's getting a lot of attention in social media, a lot of the talk with trauma that people get confused about is the notion of right or wrong. Trauma has nothing to do with right or wrong. Trauma has everything to do with normalization. And so when we understand the brain, the purpose of the brain is just to keep us alive. That's it. The purpose of the brain is just to keep us alive. And the way that it does that is that it normalizes experiences and takes those experiences and twists them and see, okay, is this an experience that I want to keep? Or do I want to change or modify it? But I can't do that unless, again, I have those skills, which is why, again, we see so many people stuck. Now, you know, I only went up to the age of 30. We know how many of us know 50, 60, 70-year-olds that are still stuck when we have conversations or when they start to feel certain emotions. Oh, you're back to the age of 12. Oh, you're back to the age of 5. So I'm going to draw my version of the brain. So I want you all to think of a brain that looks like a cashew. And I want us to focus on 2 areas. The first area that we're going to focus on is called the amygdala. And the second area is called the prefrontal cortex. So this is a horrible, horrible picture. In all my years of drawing this, I haven't gotten any better, but you get the point. So the amygdala, most primitive part of the brain, it's in our limbic system, right? Our limbic system is our reward center. So the reward center is responsible for pleasure. So sex, drugs, music, shopping, money, all of those things target this limbic system, our reward center. The amygdala, what I want you all to understand, is responsible for giving emotions to memory. So every single emotion that we have, every single emotion that we have, every single memory that we have, there's an emotional connection. Meaning that every time I remember something, I have an emotional response to that memory. Now, the amygdala feeds into this prefrontal cortex, this area of our brain right behind our forehead. And so the prefrontal cortex is responsible for something called executive functioning, or our ability to make decisions, our ability to know right from wrong. I want us just to take a moment, and I want us to answer the question. So at what age, and those of you who are at a computer or are able to type this in, I want to just ask you a question. We can play with each other for a minute since I can't see you all. But at what age do we think people know right from wrong, right? They know what they should. We hear that all the time. They know better. They should do better. What age do we think happens? Just type your answers in the comments. What age do we think people know right? They know what they should do. They know what they shouldn't do. Right? We tell it to, if you're a parent, you tell it to your child all the time, you know better, you should do better. Sharice is saying 12, Alicia saying 7. What age do we think people know right from wrong? So this prefrontal cortex, this area of our brain that gives us that filter, isn't Sherry saying 11, Tia saying 8, Christina saying 5, Patrice is saying 7, Melvin 2, Sadia 6. So 25, 26 years old. That prefrontal cortex, our ability to make rational decisions, our ability to have what we call that higher order thinking, isn't developed until about 25, 26 years old. So if any of you were watching the docuseries, yeah, Kelly in general, yes, 25. So, and it actually continues to develop way into adulthood. And so for many of us watching this docuseries, the common theme that was heard, Christopher 100, yes. And so when we think about this, what we're seeing are people who got involved in relationships before their ability to make decisions, before that part of their brain was even developed. And so how do we learn how to make decisions then? Well, it feeds off of this amygdala, right? Our amygdala is the most primitive part of our brain. The amygdala is responsible for giving emotions to memory. But a lot of times when we talk about this prefrontal cortex, so I'll give you an example. How many of us can think about someone that we've wanted to say some things to, right? I may have wanted to say some things to a coworker. I may have wanted to say some things to a spouse, to a partner. And I have this lovely filter that comes down and say, oh, you know what? I still need this job, or I still want to be married to this person, or, you know, I still need to make sure I'm a good parent, right? So that filter comes down. Now with this amygdala, if this amygdala has been activated, this amygdala is also responsible for what is known as our flight or fight system. So with trauma activates this system. So trauma activates this fight or flight system. So when I am posed with a threat, I have about 2 to 3 seconds to decide whether or not I'm going to fight this thing, whether or not I'm going to run from this thing. And then with trauma, a third system is even activated called freeze. So I can't fight you, I can't run from you, I have to freeze and take it. And so Kelly's prefrontal filter doesn't activate. And so when we think about this, when we think about what we're seeing with trauma, a lot of times people are literally frozen. I can't do anything. I'm stuck. Again, if we think about that social emotional timeline, I'm literally stuck in a place and I can't make a decision. Now, I'm going to do a visual for everyone, and it's very, very basic. So no matter how much technology develops, let me turn this way. No matter how much technology develops, the human body develops the same way every time. We develop tail up, meaning that my arm represents our spinal cord, my thumb represents our amygdala, and my fist or my hand around it represents this prefrontal cortex. Now, when this amygdala is triggered, my prefrontal cortex is literally firing, meaning I can't make rational decisions. Let's think about ourselves. When I'm upset, when I'm angry, when I'm hurt, you know, when I'm sad, I'm not thinking rationally. I'm literally doing anything that comes to mind. I'm literally doing anything that's going to help me calm down or help me get more upset or help me get more angry. And so when we think about this amygdala, if I have experienced trauma at a very young age, what kind of memories am I pulling from? Right? What kind of emotions am I pulling from? When we think about terms such as love, when we think about terms such as fear, when we think about terms such as safety, I've gotten a mixed message about what that looks like. And so my ability to make rational decisions is literally like this. I can't make rational decisions, or even if I try, I'm not able to sustain it because I don't have a vantage point or a healthy base to move from. And so if I have learned at any point that, you know, love is dangerous, or love is something that is used as a position of power, which trauma is a violation of, right? Trauma takes my power and gives it to someone who has violated it. Then what am I going to do? I'm going to make decisions that make me feel normal versus right or wrong. And so again, the purpose of the brain is literally just to keep us alive. And so if I've been going, or if I've been experiencing traumatic situations, what does my brain do in order to keep me alive? The brain normalizes it. This is the way that people communicate anger. This is the way that people communicate love. This is the way that people communicate sadness. This is the way that people communicate intimacy, right? And then if we think about abuse, if I think about that, you know, if I think that early on, if we think about sexual abuse, one of the things that sexual abuse does, it activates the brain, but it also activates the body. So my brain can have one signal and my body is responding differently in order to serve as a protective mechanism. And so I've learned that sex or intimacy is associated with power. And then I get into a relationship where intimacy is brought into question. I don't know what to do. I freeze, right? That fight, flight, or freeze system. I freeze, and then I go back to unhealthy relationships. And so when we think about all of this, again, and when we think about the brain too, one of the things that I also want us to remember is that the amygdala, again, let's make it general. Let's go from trauma. Let's go to social media, right? Social media is very good at targeting our amygdala to get us to do things that are going to get more likes, to get more comments, to get more posts, right? I'm going to make me feel connected to a group of people because that's what my base is, that social emotional learning, that social emotional development. And then I'm going to behave a certain way. And so when we think about trauma, and especially in relationships where there's a power differential, if I can control this amygdala, then your prefrontal cortex, your behavior, your ability to know right from wrong, I'm able to control that too, which is what we see when we talk about abuse. I'm able to control because I've taken over that feeling of safety, taken over that feeling of security here with you. And so when we talk about this, one of the things that I want us to understand too is that when trauma occurs, it causes a disruption in our brain's development. So we literally can look at trauma. We can look at individuals who've been impacted by trauma as young as 3 months. And one of the ways that we tell for infants who've been impacted by trauma is lack of eye contact. Now, the interesting thing that we see is that usual lack of eye contact doesn't go away. You know, for those of you in helping professions, or those of you who have experienced trauma yourselves or survivors of trauma, how many of us know, okay, when someone's talking to me or when I feel threatened, the first place I look is down. Right? I don't want to make that eye contact because that's activating that amygdala, that's firing it up. When we look at children ages preschool to 5, one of the things that we also see there too, so trauma takes away my power. So what will I try to control? With preschoolers, we see what? I try to control what I eat. I try to control when I go to sleep. And I try to control when I go to the bathroom. I try to take that control back in order to have some sense of normalcy and again, some sense of power restored back to me. When we look at children ages 6 to 11, some of the trauma behaviors that we see are impulsivity, hyperactivity, inability to pay attention. Now that sounds like a common diagnosis, right? ADHD. So one of the big pushes in the field of trauma is to have children who have diagnoses ADHD also screen for something called adverse childhood experiences. Are they responding to trauma that's occurring in their life? Difficulties with memory. So when we're thinking about trauma, one of the things that we also want to see is that it disrupts my ability to process information. It disrupts my ability to remember information, literally because I'm just trying to maintain what I already have. And so for a child or even for an adult, I'm not going to remember, you know, that I need to understand my multiplication table or my additions table. I need to forget what's going on at home. I'm going to forget all of it. Right? So we see problems in school. When we look at adults, how does that impact adults? We look at sleeping. We look at eating. You know, I'm not going to remember that I need to eat today. I'm not going to remember that I need to sleep today because that anxiety is built up. So above our kidneys, sit two adrenal glands, and they're responsible for the production of cortisol. Now, cortisol is considered our stress hormone. And so cortisol is a key component in our fight or flight system. Sorry, that's my cat. So cortisol is a key component in our fight or flight system. And so what cortisol does is that when I feel stressed or when I feel anxious, I have this cortisol release because, again, it's supposed to help me either fight against this thing or run against this thing. And so, yeah, Dawn, I'll come back to the ACEs, yes. And so when we think about this, if I can't fight against you, if I can't run from you, if I have to freeze, where does the cortisol go? The cortisol literally starts to attack different organs in my body, which is why we know that stress makes any type of illness that we have last longer. We know that it makes it more severe. And so when we look at cortisol, the impact of cortisol, the impact of trauma on someone's quality of life has significant impact literally on the length that we live. And that goes directly to both what Melvin and Dawn are asking about, which are adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs. So a study almost about 20 years ago occurred in California by a researcher named Vincent Folletti. And he actually looked at about 17,000 subjects who were trying to lose weight. So the important thing to remember about adverse childhood experiences, or this study, this phenomenon, is that it didn't happen with trauma. It happened with people trying to lose weight. And I remember speaking with him several years ago. Thank you for posting that link, Melvin. And he talked about the person or the client in the study that made him actually start to look at trauma. He looked at a woman who was able to lose over 100 pounds, over 150 pounds in a relatively short amount of time just by doing diet and exercise. And so after she was able to lose this weight, she gained it back rapidly, and they couldn't understand why. And they brought her in for a consultation, and she explained to them that someone at her job gave her a compliment. And it reminded her of her grandfather, who would compliment her before he would abuse her. And so when we think about trauma, she used food as a way to try to protect herself from being abused, right? So this prompted this huge study against 17,000 people, and they literally narrowed it down to 10 questions that occur in your life before the age of 18. Right? So some of the questions include, did you grow up in a household where you had a family member incarcerated? Did you grow up in a household where domestic violence was present? Did you grow up in a household where someone had a mental health disorder? Did you grow up in a household where you were homeless? Did you grow up in a household where your parents were divorced? And so when we look at this, out of these 10 questions, what they found, that if a person could respond yes to 4 of them, 4 out of the 10, they were more likely to have, again, that frozen or that stuck social emotional development, right? So that is issues with that amygdala and that prefrontal cortex. They were more likely to experience that. They were more likely to engage in unhealthy behavior. Now, why is that? Because, again, when I experience trauma, I'm looking for ways to feel. I'm looking for ways to either feel good or feel better or feel bad, right? Or to feel numb, not bad, or to feel numb. And so what helps me do that? Drugs, sex, without any type of emotional connection, high risk activities. And then what does that lead to? It leads to early death, right? So literally the impact or having experienced 4 or more, what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, leads to people being more likely to have lower qualities of life and quantities of life too. So thank you all for bringing that back. If anyone wants any further research on it too, University of Philadelphia has actually expanded upon this work and actually created something called urban ACEs. Now we're going to get into this topic in February. So again, please be sure to leave your email addresses either in the comments or DM me, because one of the things that they also look at is community violence, right? The impact of community violence, discrimination, which is something that we know discrimination is a form of trauma. And so how do we bring all that into someone's quality and quantity of life too? So when we get into this, one of the things that, okay, so now we understand about the brain. So I know that the amygdala gets fired up and it's giving me all these mixed cues. How does that impact my emotional state? So I'm going to draw a bell curve. And one of the things that I want us to remember, and I talked about this in our last session, is that there are 2 emotions that we have, 2 basic emotions that we have. Every emotion that we feel can be summed up to one of these 2 emotions. we're moving, we're operating, we're acting either out of a place of fear or out of a place of love. When we think about trauma, trauma is literally a fear response. It's an anxiety response. And so with that, I'm moving in a way that, out of anger, I'm moving in a way out of frustration. I'm going back to this person, or I'm staying in this relationship because I'm scared. And so with our emotions go on this bell curve. Every emotion that we feel is neutral, meaning that our emotions, I don't know if you all can see this, either have the power to either motivate us or immobilize us. Every emotion that we feel, right? So when we look at what's going on in society, a lot of people are angry. So they are being motivated by that anger. A lot of times when we think about trauma, a lot of things that we'll hear is that, oh, this person needs an anger management class, or this person needs to learn how to control their anger. And the reality of it is that people who have experienced trauma are very good at controlling their anger. Actually, I'm a big proponent of joy management classes, because how many of us either know someone or have ourselves self-sabotage, right? Things are going well for me. I'm doing great. And then I self-sabotage because I get scared, right? And so all of our emotions go on this bell curve. And all of our emotions have trigger points. So I'm going to use me and my lovely family because they serve as my motivation and my trigger points. So many of you know I have a little girl. Her name is Lola. Lola has never slept past 5:30 a day in her life, right? Never. And she likes to come in my room. This morning, she scared me. She tried to surprise me. And so that's a trigger point there. Once Lola wakes up, she likes to hug our cat awake. So every morning, I also save my cat's life. I'm not joking, right? I'll be laying in the bed and I'll hear the cat cry and I know it's time for me to get up. I also have a son who is in the clean versus dirty stage. I don't know if any of you parents of boys can relate to that or understand that, right? So some days he may take a shower, some days he may recycle his clothes, some days he gets in the shower and the only thing that's wet are his knees and below. So it's 7:30 and I'm here, right? We haven't even left the house yet, but my trigger points are activated. And then maybe there's traffic on my way to work. Maybe I have to work on something that I don't want to work on. It involves me talking to somebody that I don't want to talk to. So that filter that we talked about, that filter is working overtime to make sure I say the right thing, make sure I do the right thing. Right? And maybe there's traffic on the way home. And then I get home and someone has left the top off the toothpaste. Right? So everybody has to die tonight because someone has left the top off the toothpaste. Right? So, I'm telling them how they don't appreciate me as a mom. I'm telling them they don't appreciate my hard work that I'm doing, to make sure, that I buy the best toothpaste that they could have, and then I'm saying I'm never buying toothpaste ever again. And then, filter is on. So maybe I'll throw away all the toothpaste. So now none of us can brush our teeth ever again. Right. So I'm here. I'm at this point. Now we all know, and I use this as a joke because it's being recorded. But I use this as a joke because we know that the toothpaste is not the reason why I'm losing it. What has happened is something called hyperarousal. Hyperarousal, meaning that I'm raging, right? I'm up here. I'm raging. I'm numb. If I'm experiencing trauma, I may have a panic attack. I'm breathing fast. I don't know what to do with my emotional state. I may engage in what we call self-injurious behavior. So I may cut, I may drink, I may do drugs, I may have sex. I need something to bring me down. I have gone out of, if we can think now about this bell curve with having two parallel lines, I've gone out of what is called my window of tolerance. For every emotion that we feel, we have a window of tolerance, meaning that I can tolerate this emotion up until a certain point, and then when it gets to this certain point, I'm going to have a reaction. So for me, maybe with anger, so say anger is this emotion that's on my bell curve. And for me, I can control my anger when it's between a 4 and a 7, right? On a scale of 1 to 10. I can still be nice to people. I can still get my work done. I can still make sure I'm making dinner. I can still make sure I'm cooking. But once it gets to an 8, all bets are off, right? I'm starting to walk around the house and say, who hasn't cleaned their room? I'm calling home. Did you wash the dishes? Did you do this? Right? I'm looking for reasons to be angry. How many of us can relate to that, right? I'm looking for something that's going to take me over this curve. And so when we do this, when I get here, this hyperarousal, all bets are off. And someone comes to me and they say, hey, Tara, hey, Dr. Tara, calm down. Do I say, oh, thank you guys so much. I was waiting for somebody to tell me to calm down all day. I'm so glad you tapped me on my shoulder to tell me to calm down. Is that my response when I'm up here? Is that our response? No, right? What do? I go off even more off this bell curve. And so when we think about that, a lot of times when we're talking about trauma work, we've been taught, you know, oh, this is where you start to do coping skills, right? This is where you start to take care of yourself. But right here does not work. It doesn't work. It's like, you know, the equation or the analogy that I often give, or the example rather, is when do we put on our seatbelts? We put on our seatbelts the moment that we get into the car, right? It takes me about a second, but can I imagine putting my seatbelt on as a 18-wheeler is driving face on to me? I wouldn't do it. This 2-second opportunity I wouldn't do, right? And so the same thing happens here. The same thing happens again with my handy dandy visual, right? When my amygdala is firing and you tell me to calm down, I literally don't have the skills to do that. I can't do that. And so when I get here, I'm not allowing my emotions to continue down this bell curve. I'm going to shut the emotion off, right? And so instead of going hyper arousal, so now I'm raging, I'm yelling, I'm fussing, I'm cussing, I'm doing whatever, I'm experiencing something called hyperarousal, meaning that now I'm numb, right? Now I can begin to dissociate. Now I'm beginning to, you know, I tell them, I don't care what you all do, just leave me alone. How many of us have ever done that, right? We rage. Now just leave me alone. I don't want to do anything. And so when we do that, what happens to our body's ability to understand and to comprehend and to make healthy decisions? It goes out of the window because I'm either at a state of hyperarousal or I'm at a state of hypoarousal. And when we think about working with survivors of trauma, that's usually where they come, right? I'm either at a state of I'm willing to be mean or I'm willing to push everyone out, right? So I'm going to push you out before you have a chance to hurt me again, because again, with trauma, it's about power. I want to take back my power. So if I have to push you away so you won't hurt me, I'm willing to do that. Or I don't care, right? I'm resigned. I'm giving up, you know, and so I'm hypo-aroused. I'm unable to start to feel. And so when we get into part 2 next week, we're going to spend a lot of time breaking this down and seeing how do we start to implement coping skills before it gets to that 10. How do we start, when we think about surviving trauma, how do we start to make ourselves not get triggered? You know, one of the things that was so interesting to me watching the docuseries is listening to how many people were triggered. And so, you know, all of us, when we were watching the docuseries, or so many people ended the docuseries here, right? For arousal. I saw so many posts about people not being able to go to sleep, people not being able, you know, to think, because I left off here. When we think about true trauma-informed care is always going to be about safety, right? So love has nothing to do with it. A lot of times people will debate love. You know, you love me if you do this. You don't love me if you don't take the trash out. When we think about true trauma-informed care and relationships, the goal, and we'll talk about this more next week, is always going to be safety. Is this a relationship that you feel safe in? Even if the relationship is one where I'm watching television and I'm getting triggered and I'm so caught up in it that I don't know what to do with this information. So now I have to be wired. I'm not able to protect myself in that moment, too, even if it's on TV or radio. And so part of our work when we talk about self-care is disconnecting from those things that take us outside of our window of power. Because one of the things that we know with trauma is that everybody also has what is called a trauma tolerance, meaning that, you know, if we think about trauma on a spectrum, all of us are exposed to events or situations where, you know, it's going to take me experiencing this event these many times before I start to do things. We see it with health, right? So it's going to take me getting a headache before I take a self-care day. It's going to take me getting a headache and a stomach ache before I take a self-care day. It's going to take, when we look at some of the people involved in the docuseries, it's going to take me being in a room by myself, my parents being called in, this person being called in, this documentary to happen before, again, I start to understand that maybe something is not safe or maybe something is not healthy for me. And so when we understand this, one of the things that we're going to talk about is that how do we start to break that down? And really, when we think about true trauma-informed care, how do we start to shorten our trauma tolerance? When we think about people that we see, you know, think about people in our lives. Again, everybody is a survivor of something that they would consider to be traumatic, and things that they take, okay, you know what is it going to take me? What is it going to take for me to go to the dentist? What is it going to take for me to do this? What is it going to take for me to practice mindfulness? What is it going to take for me to have a better relationship with my child? A lot of us are on this spectrum, right? This extreme. I'm going to have to experience all of this before I begin to see that it's an issue. Our goal when we think about trauma-informed care, can I bring you down a few, right? Can I bring you down a few numbers? Can I get you within your window of tolerance, or understanding that your trauma tolerance is too high? Because one of the things also with trauma too, with the normalization of trauma, is that I don't see it. How many of us, you know people where trauma is intergenerational? So if I experience the trauma, I'm more likely to parent my child based on my own traumatic experiences. So if this happened to me, because I've normalized it, I've taken it to mean that, okay, this is how you raise a child, or this is how you engage with a partner or someone that you love in a relationship. And so I'm going to engage it this way based on my own traumatic experiences. Trauma impacts every single relationship that we have. And thank you. I'm glad that you're getting it. And yes, we're going to do a mindfulness training. We have a whole section on mindfulness as well. And so when we think about this, one of the things that I want understand too, when we look at that bell curve, we did it just for a day, but I want us to think about it based on a lifetime of experiences. So at 2 years old, this happened. At 6 years old, this happened. At 7 years old, this happened. At 13 years old, this happened. So now I'm 30 and I'm just in a place of hyperarousal. Or now I'm 30 and I'm in a place of hypoarousal, right? I'm just numb about everything. So one of the things that happens with that is that it gets us caught up in something that's called a trauma triangle. And the trauma triangle starts off as a literal example, but it literally starts to take shape and starts to take form in all of our relationships throughout our lives. And so when we think about the trauma triangle, and I'm going to draw it out, I want you all to think about 3 points from the triangle. The first point is the victim. At the top of the triangle, you have the perpetrator. And then the third point of the triangle, it's two roles that can switch or be, person can switch or be simultaneous. You have either someone who's the abandoning authority, or the rescuer. Let me bring up my handy dandy book. So here you have the victim, perpetrator, abandoning authority, or the rescuer. So let's take the example of a child who grew up in a home where domestic violence is present and also physical violence is present, right? So this child is very clearly identified as the victim, right? The perpetrator is who? So someone who inflicts the abuse, someone who causes this trauma. So usually for children, it's someone that they love. Now let's break this down a little bit too, right? So someone that I love, someone who's abused their power. How do they get to do that? Oh, because they target my amygdala, right? They make me feel safe, that amygdala right here, they make me feel safe. And now they're able to get me to behave in a way that they want, right? Because they have taken some power. They're now controlling this prefrontal cortex. If I'm able to make you feel safe, or if I'm able to, one of the things that we talked about too before is that delight. If I'm able to show you delight, or if I'm able to make you feel good about yourself, then I can get you to do what I want you to do, right? So that perpetrator is usually someone that I've trusted, someone that has built me up and then takes me down. So we see that ebb and flow. And then this last point is the abandoning authority or rescuer. And this can be the same person or different people. Now, the abandoning authority for a child, what we see in a lot of these docuseries is another parent, right? So maybe if child abuse is going on in a home, maybe this other parent is experiencing abuse themselves. So I can't come in and save you. I can't rescue you from this situation because I'm experiencing this as well. So I'm an authority figure, but I'm abandoning you in this moment, right? So I'm an abandoning authority. I am someone in a position of power who can't save you from this trauma. Or maybe, I'm a parent and I didn't know that this trauma was occurring. So I'm an authority figure, but I'm abandoning you in this moment. / rescuer. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to save you. I'm going to remove you. So we're going to come in and what we're seeing, right? I'm coming in, I'm taking my child back. I'm rescuing you. Now, what happens is that people then start to assume these roles in their relationships. So this is a very, very clear example of how trauma occurs and these roles that people play. Now, what happens is that I literally start to assume these roles in my relationships. So if I'm the victim of a trauma here as a child, how do I learn to identify myself? I learned to identify myself through my trauma story, right? This happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. No one loves me. No one's going to be there. I can't trust anyone. One that we see with teenagers who've experienced trauma that goes into adulthood, distrust of the world, high emphasis on material goods because I want to look good. What does looking good give me? It gives me a sense of power, right? When I look good, I can control you, right? When I'm making millions, when I'm selling this, when I'm doing this, I have a sense of power. So I've learned to create an identity outside of myself that's based on power because I see myself as a victim. And so when we think about this, one of the things that we also want to say, and I'll get to some of the comments, is that when we understand bliss level, we're going to actually debunk this next week. So make sure y'all tune in too. One of the things that we see is that I start to take these relationship roles, with these roles on in relationships. So I'm the victim here. And even though, you know, I've been the victim in these certain relationships or this experience, I take this role on into my relationships. And so one of the things that we understand is that, okay, I have been the victim of this experience, but now when you do something to me, or when I'm wrong, or when I'm threatened, or I feel threatened, one of the things that we do is I become the victim too. I take on this victim mentality. So, you know, I was wrong, but how dare you say that I was wrong? And so even though you're trying to help me, you now become the perpetrator. Or one of the things that we see as well is that people can be both the perpetrator and the victims of themselves. And this is especially true when we think about trauma, because trauma eats away at my identity of self, and it also eats away at my feeling of self-worth. And so this is where we think about self-sabotage. So I'm doing well, I'm doing well, I'm doing well, I'm doing well. I hear this tape replaying in my mind, I don't deserve this. So I become the victim of myself. Or, you know, I'm reaching out to other people and I want someone to rescue me. I want someone to save me. I feel like I can't save myself. And so when you don't save me, how dare you leave me by myself, and I become the victim again. Right? Hopefully this is all making sense to people. Hopefully you all are nodding your heads virtually. And so when we think about this, one of the things that we always want to be mindful of is how this trauma triangle literally starts to impact and seep its way into relationships, which is why we can have, you know, parents who act like the victim of their children, right? So your child disappoints you. How dare you're killing me, you're doing this. And so that guilt then starts to drive relationships if I'm not able to manage or maintain my trauma. Or I become a person, I'm sick, right? I've experienced trauma, but I'm going to save you because by me saving you, you're going to save me too, right? And so I'm looking for my savior outside of myself. I'm looking for someone to rescue me. But guess what? If you leave me, then I'm going to be by myself. And we start this trauma triangle all over again. It never stops. Or I'm going to always look for someone to play out this perpetrator. So someone is treating me better. Someone's treating me nice. And I don't know what to do with them. So I reject them, right? Because I'm used to relationships operating in this triangle. I'm used to relationships operating where someone is the perpetrator, where someone has to save me, or I'm looking outside of myself for my savior, right? And so we start to hear this. We heard this all throughout the docuseries. This person made me feel good. They saved me from this. They saved me from this lifestyle. They took me out of this lifestyle. I didn't feel like I could do it myself. So I'm looking for someone else. And then they become the perpetrator and I'm the victim. But then when they become the perpetrator, they make me feel like I'm the one who's done something wrong. How many of us know people like that, right? They do something wrong, but we end up apologizing. I'm gonna just let that go, you know. So when we think about that, we always want to be mindful of where our roles are within this trauma triangle. When we come back next week, one of the things that we're going to talk about that is so important is how do we start to break this down. And so I'll give us just a little hint. In trauma work, this is so important. We don't use this term survivor. We don't use this term victim. There are no victims in trauma work. There are only survivors. You have survived some of the worst things that could have happened to you. And in order to do that, you have to see that there's strength here. And one of the things, Christina, I see that your comment, when I see you as a survivor, or when I see myself as a survivor, I don't need to be rescued, right? Because survivors can't be rescued. They've already been saved. And so one of the ways that we're going to get into that, one of the things that we're going to do with that is see how do we get ourselves out of this trauma triangle? Because as long as I'm telling this trauma triangle, or as long as I'm finding myself in this trauma triangle, this cycle is going to continue. And I'll always be operating from a trauma vantage point where I'm operating out of one or two emotional states. And they are either depression or anxiety. And again, if you're just joining us, one of the things that I said is please make sure you leave your email address. I want to make sure I stay connected to you all. Please, if you feel comfortable, leave it in the comments, or if you want to just DM me, you can do that as well. So when we think about trauma, trauma triggers our anxiety response, right? Because trauma triggers my anxiety. I have to move, I have to run, I have to fight you, or I have to freeze. Now, it also triggers something called our anxiety thinking. So anxiety thinking is future tense, right? So anxiety thinking, those what if statements. So anxiety, Akili, Ms. McCoy, we'll go back over the trauma triangle next week, but if you want, you can send me a private message and I'll try to break it down some more. Anxiety thinking, what if thinking, right? So what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? I'm always in the future. I cannot get rest now because I'm always 10 steps ahead. But how many of us have ever gone just by a show of light? How many of us have ever tried to take a nap and I can't fall asleep because I'm thinking of all the things that I have to do? Or how many of us have ever tried to have a conversation with someone and we have a conversation before the person even shows up, right? They're going to say this and then I'm going to say this and then they're going to say this and then I'm going to say this, right? I'm already at the end of the conversation before the person is even there. And so when we think about this, anxiety future tense of what has happened, a lot of times it's based on depression, which is past tense. So depression, past tense thinking, this should have happened. This didn't happen. Why didn't this happen? Because this happened, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen, right? Or because this person didn't love me, you're probably not going to love me either, right? So again, past tense thinking, which triggers anxiety thinking. This becomes a cycle. This becomes my thought process because depression thinking and anxiety thinking. When we're getting to understand how to get out of surviving trauma, one of the things that we want to come into is something as simple as the present moment. We want to move here, right? I want to get out of these two thought processes or two thought patterns and get into this present moment, because in the present moment is where my power lies, right? The reality with trauma, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that it happened. And with that happening, this is the term that we use, and some of you may remember this from the last live that we did, is a term called and yet I can still heal, right? I can't be stuck in the trauma triangle and heal because I'll either be seeing myself as the victim, I need to put myself in that perpetrator role, I need to be the rescuer of everybody else in order to save myself. And so if I'm rescuing you, I'm always thinking anxious thoughts about you, right? I'm never able to think healing thoughts about you or healing thoughts about myself because I'm only seeing my worth and my ability to save someone else. Somebody asked the question, what if we don't know if we've ever had trauma? So my training in working with survivors of trauma, and this may go against the school of thought from what other counselors or other experts, and every counselor is different. I'll yield to their expertise. But when I was seeing clients many moons ago, one of the things that we were taught is that a person never has to tell their trauma story to us, because part of your brain's protective factor is repression, is forgetting, right? So in order to keep you alive, I need to move past all that has happened in order to make you a functioning individual. And so with that being said, I may not know if I've experienced a trauma. And so with the work within the present moment, even if I can't pinpoint certain events, but if I can pull out unhealthy relationship patterns and start to work on them that I'm engaging in, not of other people, but that I'm engaging in, I can start to tell my recovery story. And that's always the focus of trauma work. I want to get you into the present moment because that's where your power lies. And I want to move you in a way that enables you to tell your recovery story as well. And so one of the things that we talked about too, when we think about trauma, understanding too, and Dawn, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we're actually working on with several school districts is social emotional learning. And that's where we're going to go to. When we think about the social emotional connection, I want to find safety in the present moment, understanding that the present moment may not have always been safe, but in this moment now, I can start to create the future and the life that I deserve. But I have to come out of that trauma triangle first, and I have to, again, cater to this amygdala. I have to cater to these social emotional needs so that I literally can get my cognitive functioning to change. And the biggest thing that I want us to take away from the training tonight, because we're almost at time, is that a lot of times when people think about trauma, or when people think about people in general, we make generalizations, right? They should know better, they should do better, they were too smart for this, or they were doing something else. We're targeting this. We're not targeting the amygdala, which is responsible, again, for emotions. What are my emotions? Every memory that we have, I want us to remember that has an emotional connection. And so when we think about doing this work, the work starts with making a connection. The work starts literally with making people feel emotionally and physically safe. If I'm able to do that, what I'm literally able to do is help them to create their own narrative for how they want their recovery to be. So when we look at these docuseries that we see, or when we look at the case of Centoya Brown and everything else that's going on, what we're looking at are trauma stories playing out in social media that give everybody around us a chance to weigh in. But we really want to start, again, starting at birth, at conception. When we look at, parental stress and how that impacts pregnancy and throughout the lifespan, how trauma literally impacts us throughout the lifespan, the conversations that I have, the relationships that I make, the people that I'm attracted to, right? So I've had this trauma, you've had this trauma, it's a traumatic match made in trauma heaven, right? And so how do I start to break out of these patterns and these cycles that, one, I may have been exposed to, one that I may have started myself, or some that I even want to switch or modify so that I can create the story that I want. So we are almost at time. I want to make sure that everyone, again, puts their email address. We want to stay connected to people. We're going to have part 2 of Surviving Trauma next Tuesday. Next Tuesday is the 15th. I just looked at my calendar. So Tuesday the 15th at 9 o'clock, we're going to shift this. So we talked a lot this evening about trauma. And I want to say again, for those of you who are just joining in, this is about as condensed of a workshop that I've ever done on trauma. Our trauma workshops, easily 6 hours, easily 6 months. But breaking down what trauma looks like, what trauma feels like, how it impacts the brain, how it starts to impact our view of ourselves and our view of other people. And then we're going to move from this, and we're also going to focus next week a lot on attachment to and how we start to move from this and create healthy relationships, one with ourselves first. So how do we literally start to dismantle that trauma triangle and move from the term victor to survivor and create our own recovery stories? So I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for your comments. Also, if there's something that you want us to expand upon, or you want me to expand upon for next Tuesday, please feel free to put it in the comments. I read every comment. Please feel free to put it in the comments, and I'll make sure that we touch on it. If we get a chance to next Tuesday, I'll try to put it in the agenda. Again, this is so long. We will be doing workshops. We will be doing online courses coming soon, so be on the lookout for all of that. But I wanted to just with everything going on in our community, everything going on that we see, one of the things that I want to just leave you all with is make sure that you're protecting yourself, right? Self-care is not always going to get a massage or going to get our nails done, or, doing self-care sometimes is turning off the TV when I realize that something is making my heart race or making me start to sweat or giving me a pit feeling in my stomach that I can't handle. And that is a great form of self-care. One of the things I've learned from watching trauma survivors, there's certain movies, there's certain TV shows that I won't watch because it's too much of an overload. And we always want to protect, again, this part of our brain, right? So, sometimes it's called system 1, or our baby brain and our big brain, right? Or our small brain and our big brain. I want to protect my amygdala. I want to protect the thing that's keeping me going, because again, that's what I'm acting on when I'm feeling anxious or when I'm feeling threatened to. So thank you all so much for joining in. I truly, truly appreciate it. If you loved it, please share. I feel like Lola, tell us in the comments if you want to, again, if you want to hear something else, or if you want to talk about something else, any other topics that you all are interested in the field of mental health, emotional wellness. We're definitely going to do. We're going to do mindfulness. Also, some of the other topics we have coming up is talking to our children about race for parents. But again, next Tuesday, please join in for Surviving Trauma Part 2. Everyone have a great night. Peace.